Natives in conflict. So we've seen the federal policy of basically forcing Native Americans onto reservation. And the thing is about this, most tribes accepted the government's conditions, basically because their survival depended on it. But you do see some of the larger tribes resisting in this time period. And so we're going to see like warfare is going to engulf the advancing frontier, especially like back in the 1850s and 1860s, which I know kind of starts crossing over into, would that be part of 1301 or 1302? Typically we include it in 1302 just because there's a lot of other things happening at that time also. So when we're seeing this warfare across the West, sometimes it is Native Americans attacking, but more often than not, it is white people precipitating this violence. An example of this is the Sand Creek Massacre. In Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864, they have the discovery of gold. So white people come rushing in, and they basically wanted to eliminate the native Cheyenne and Arapahoes that lived there. And in fact, white people would attack under John Chivington, who was a minister at this time, and they basically killed all the natives at Sand Creek indiscriminately. Now, Westerners would justify this attack against natives as basically, oh, this was just a means to secure their own opportunity. You even have a quote by one of the individuals involved in this attack said, and I quote, "Complete extermination is our motto." So it's very clear what this offensive's eventual goal was to be. We see other offensives against Native Americans, such as like a military offensive against the Sioux in 1866, although this actually failed completely by the United States side. In fact, the United States government actually had to sue for peace because of just the continual cost and Easterners' shock at the military's indiscriminate aggression, and this is going to end up with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. In this treaty, the United States actually abandoned the Bozeman Trail and other posts in Sioux territory. And so for a time, the Sioux had actually overcome the United States government. But I say for a time for a reason. Now, we're going to come back to this in a second. So the thing is, we're seeing the Army is involved out west when it comes to violence against Native Americans, but they also did a lot more than that. They're the ones building roads, they're involved in scientific activities, they're distributing rations and clothing, settling civil disputes, but really their primary role in the West was military, and it was against the Native Americans. So we're going to see over time the United States Army is going to have a new strategy when it comes to dealing with Native Americans. This new strategy being seen as winter campaigns directed against Native American villages. The thing is, Native villages tended to be weaker in the winter, whereas the United States Army had backups when it comes to supplies as well as, personnel. And so these winter campaigns are going to end up with really heavy casualties, specifically amongst like women and children in the West. The survivors of these campaigns, the native survivors, are going to be impoverished and basically starving. And this is basically how the United States secures like the southern plains by about 1875. Which brings us back to the northern plains, which you can see on this map, like the Sioux tended to have at this point. So the thing is, white people hadn't given up taking over the northern plains, even with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And so the railroad industry is actually going to decide to cut straight through Sioux territory and didn't stop building, even though they weren't supposed to be building there. They would also kill buffalo for food, deplete their numbers, and hurt a lot of the Native Americans. And so by 1874, this is really upsetting the Sioux. understandably so. And more white people are coming onto their property, and when the Sioux asked the government to, hey, enforce the treaty they had made, the United States Army actually insisted on the Native Americans leaving their hunting grounds. Well, the Native Americans are going to refuse. And so this is when we get the United States Army attacking, and then we have the Native Americans attacking back under Crazy Horse, repulsing this United States Army offensive at the Battle of Rosebud. Then you get other Native Americans groups are going to join in, and this is when you get like the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Battle of Little Bighorn technically overwhelms the American column. Technically, the United States Army loses this. However, basically the Native Americans couldn't follow up this attack with any kind of dramatic conquest. And so basically they weren't supplied and equipped like the United States Army. And so as they do disperse afterwards, the United States Army could pursue all these different Native groups, and just you get the conquering of the Northern Plains by the United States really coming through like attrition and just the inability of traditional Indian economy to support resistance to all of these white forces. And so you see in this way the United States manages to take the northern Great Plains. You also see this being paralleled all over the United States with other groups such as like the Apaches under Geronimo in 1886, and basically all kinds of different Native American groups are going to be herded onto these barren reservations. So when it comes to life on the reservation, basically white people wanted Native Americans to adapt their white ways. They wanted a complete assimilation, as in a complete Americanization, a total cultural conquest. And specifically, a lot of Christian organizations get involved in this because they wanted the Native American children to have, Protestant beliefs. And they really wanted to change Native American religion and family life. They wanted to force, on top of that, not just religious beliefs, but they wanted to force Native Americans to accept like private ownership and market capitalism. And so on these reservations, basically Native Americans are a captive audience for these white reformers. But they have to listen, unfortunately, because their survival depends on the government rations and annual payments made to these tribes in these treaties on these reservations. But I want to come back to religion. The thing is, white people really saw Native American religion as pagan, and they basically wanted it destroyed. And so people who wanted to destroy the natives' religions actually persuaded the Bureau of Indian Affairs to frame a criminal code prohibiting tribal religious practices in 1884. And the thing is, this criminal code that prohibited tribal religious practices, so freedom of religion for everyone unless you're Native American, this remained in effect in the United States until 1933. One group that they're going to move against specifically is they wanted to ban the Sundance religion. This was a Plains Indian religion. In order to invoke this ban against the Sundance religion, the federal government would withhold rations from Native Americans, disrupt religious ceremonies, and then you see the federal government takes it even further against the Ghost Dance religion. In 1890, the United States Army would actually use artillery and kill at least 200 Sioux men, women, and children at Wounded Knee, specifically about suppressing the Ghost Dance religion. So this comes to be known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. So we're seeing ways of trying to force assimilation and force Americanization on the native peoples. Missionaries tried to convert them to Christianity, I should say, and Native Americans were reluctant. But the government wanted to do more than that. They also wanted to eliminate Indian values and traditions, and they would try to use education to do this. The government would do things like isolate Native American children from tribal influences, basically force them off of the reservations into boarding schools, where a lot of times these Native children would be confined until their adolescence, and they would be forced in these boarding schools to basically like speak English, attend Christian services, and of course profess all white values. Then we see Congress passes in 1887 the Dawes Act. Now the Dawes Act is really important because the thing is, Native Americans held land communally. The Dawes Act is basically going to divide up all of the tribal lands of these like reservations amongst individual Indians, thus trying to force the concept of private property onto them. The thing is, when they split up all these tribal lands amongst the individual Indians, there was land left over. And so basically the Dawes Act also said that any of the reservation land not allocated to an individual Indian would be opened up to white settlers. So in this way, once again, they're taking away even more land held by natives. Now, all of these ways that white people tried to force Native Americans to assimilate, quite frankly, they scarcely succeeded. You do see some Native Americans adopting like Christianity. More often they would adopt, like the formal education and the new job skills so that they could adapt to the world. But a lot of times Native Americans would then go on to like employ this kind of knowledge to specifically resist this trying to force assimilation. And Native Americans would go and lecture or lobby to reform Indian policies or work to curtail economic exploitation of their tribes. Most Native Americans, even if they were forced off reservation into these different like education centers and stuff, they tended to go back to their own ways when they returned at home. And if anything, it just made Native Americans resent all of this assimilationist effort. So I ask you this, looking at the three big minority groups we've been looking at, how was the Native Americans' experience like that of African Americans or newly arrived immigrants? And what is different between the three groups? And you could fill out like this chart if you wanted to. It's a great way to kind of pull all of your thoughts together. And it's a great way to kind of review these different aspects as for your notes.